Okay, does anybody have a question for John or Lars to begin with? Okay. Microphone?
Yep. It's for Lars. You said something about I think you said something about the exhibition space has already become psychedelic. Or was like you made some kind of either the environment that we work in or the exhibition space had become psychedelic in itself. Can you maybe because maybe it was me that misheard it, that it sounded really interesting, but I didn't. But it was just a point that completely threw me off also.
All right. No, maybe, I don't think I said that. I'm sorry. But maybe it was was it in relation to Lindman's project? Well, I guess, well, as you understood, I have this truck with the psychedelic. How can you extend it? Or how can you displace it into contemporary art practice? Does it still make sense? And what are we up against when we use the term psychedelic? What luggage does it come with? And I think, so I'm the one applying it to Lindman's practice. I'm the one sort of drawing it into my attempts at thinking art psychedelic connection. As mentioned, I think she would perhaps call her practice ecofeminist or soma aesthetic. To me, that practice shares sort of many concepts or many ideas with the psychedelic. Not least that focus. What I try to talk about here, what I try to outline, even to displace the notion of a psychedelic art, quote unquote, from the visual domain, because that's how we typically think about it, considering its op-art heritage, its sort of acid rock poster heritage, the psychedelic light show, etc. But I think it was also, and that's very important, it was also always in excess of the visual. When they did light shows in the 60s, it was not only to have something great to look at behind the band, it was to access the brain and the nervous system through the eyes, right? So that's notion of psychedelic tactility is very important to talk about, I think, on this subversive micro level of the subsensorial that Lindman talks about. So I don't know if that makes her mud hot, a psychedelicizing or tripping up of the exhibition space. Yes, maybe it does. It had these tentacles outside. You can just make them out at either end of at both ends of the mud hut. So it went outside to sort of pick up air from the outside. There was also a tentacle that went down into the ground. So there was a direct connection with the ground. So material data could theoretically or metaphorically sort of enter the space.
Picking up on that, I have a question for both of you too, because I think it's related. They have there's this idea of the scopic regimes of modernity, and those are normally, the scopic regimes of modernity are usually Cartesian perspectivalism, where you have a unique viewer whose fovea is aligned with the vanishing point. Then you have the idea of the grid, based on, believe it or not, Dutch landscape painting. It's called Baconian empiricism, and it's based on views of landscape painting in Holland from above. And then the third is the Baroque, in which you have a multiplicity of different viewers and you have distortion and things like that. Where would the psychedelic regime fit in? Or would it? Or is that a different category? Because I think that relates to what you're saying in a way. because we all bring, every time we look at something, we're bringing to that visual opportunity a history of those different kinds of visuality. So where does the psychedelic visuality come in that schema?
I think you're absolutely right. It does. For me, it's operative on a different plane.
Yeah.
Those examples of optical techniques, of systems of visual representation from perspective up until, well, I think one could go probably further than the Baroque if one wanted to articulate other models. But I think, you know, the difference is a difference of modeling. You know, the psychedelic is not a system according to which, or using the rules of which, something is represented, right? Like a perspective system, or even a folded system, as in the Baroque. You know, the psychedelic, and I think that this is why both Lars and my paper, they seem to come out, skeptical is not the right word, but we articulated different forms of provisionality or relativity in the way that these processes are mediated. And I think that's partly because, you know, we work as critics, historians, you know, within a domain in which what we're looking at is already mediated, okay? So we're looking at representations of something that represented an experience, perhaps. I mean, a lot of psychedelic, you know, you look at a psychedelic poster, what is it? It's a representation in graphic, colorful form with, you know, floating Paisley devices and auras and emanations and all of the different things we've seen in perhaps most of the talks today. But it's a system that attempts to make visible a version, perhaps, of what was experienced. But I even don't think that that's the case very often. I think it's an attempt to make visible a form of language in which that experience has already been formalized. So I feel I'm being like Plato here, right? Second, third, fourth orders of representation, with the visual artist being disadvantaged in this recessional space, to go back to Warren's point. But I think that's what we're left with. And I think that was my starting point. My starting point was the experience of just a couple of artists, you know, born in the American Midwest, migrated to LA, but they did this, their sort of migratory move was in the middle of the 70s, a whole decade after the sort of euphoria of an initial drugs culture. And this isn't actually my view necessarily, but the argument I'm making is that their view of a psychotropic imaginary was by necessity mediated by their understanding of their difference marked by that decade from an originary moment, which is of course a mythological moment, right? The original trip, the original psychedelic moment, 68, 67, Summer of Love, whatever you want to call it. My argument was that irresistibly what they did with this imagery, and even in Shaw's case with the direct experience of dreams, comes across as part of a sequence of, yes, I probably would use the term disillusionments, that they struck back against what they saw as a false euphoria and a sense of, you know, kind of as I put it, unmediated transcendentalism that Shaw would both parody and to a certain extent participate in through the Oist religion. So I think, and I won't speak for Lars, but there's a sense in which, I mean, you're making an even bigger jump because you're going from the 60s right up to the present day. And I think there are, you know, in terms of these mediations, there are several different steps and forms that you might argue you have to go through before you get to something made in 2010.
Well, let me just say one more thing. And that's exactly my point. The point was that when I was listening to your lectures, both of your lectures, it almost was like you were negating the psychotropic. It was like you were talking about everything that it wasn't. So that got me to thinking, and this is the second part of the question, which is that what happens with the psychedelic, and you mentioned, both of you were kind of mentioned this anyway, was that it's having an effect. I mean, when you think about those three regimes of modernity that I talked about, they're very much about sensing something, getting something, a spectator who sits in front of a painting and observes it and is being stimulated by it. But it's not about the recipient or the visitor projecting anything, you know. And the thing about the psychedelic art, like think of the posters, which I'm more familiar with, the Bill Graham, what was it called? The Bill Graham Theater West and the Bill Graham Theater East. We're New Yorkers. Come on, I was hanging out there. Fillmore.
Fillmore, yeah.
Is that they're producing a psychedelic effect in you that you are then it's different. You're actually you're become a producer of an effect. It stimulates your body in a way that you actually become a producer. Do you follow what does anybody get what
But
I'm
I
saying?
disagree with
No,
it, though.
You disagree with it?
Well, I don't think that's right. I don't
Okay.
think, they might produce an effect, but it's different from the example I gave earlier on in the first question, actually, about op art. I mean, op art does set out to produce an illusion, and that if you
By
see
the way, there's a
illusion...
reason op art occurred when it occurred.
Well, but if you see the illusion, then in a way you're buying into the work. And if it's kinetic, it's more complicated still, and so on and so forth. But I'm not sure that I would say, maybe Daniel would disagree, I'm not sure I would say that, you know, your psychedelic poster produced for a rock concert in the Fillmore in 67, 68, whatever it was produced, I'm not sure that that's giving you an effect of that kind. I think for me it's a report on an effect, or it's a stylization of an effect, or it's a version, or it's a representation. And however we would describe it, it's placed at least at a second order removed from it. And I think for me, that's the interesting thing. It's the question I brought up right at the beginning with your paper, the difference between experience and representation. Because I think that's actually what...
I didn't have a paper.
No, your discussion, sorry.
Could I say something? I think, on that note, yes, I would disagree with the fact that I jumped from the 60s till today. At least that was not what I set out to do. What I wanted to do with my paper was to talk about exactly the gaps and the effects and the slippages and the leaks, and try to identify a certain type of artistic strategy in relation to that. And that relates to the mediation and the processes of translation that you're also talking about now. And I think, and the psychedelic, the culture of the psychedelic, the imaginary of the psychedelic, also plays out as so many mediations, geopolitical mediations, cultural translations to Brazil, for instance, to Argentina. Marta Minorin would be an example from there. You know, all these routes and trade routes that the psychedelic, translations between different areas in culture. The Californian counterculture is one primal scene of it, but the term originates in psychiatry, right? It was coined in 1956 by, what's it called, Humphrey Osmond, psychiatrist. And after that, it was appropriated by military intelligence for their own purposes. So it has all these, it has both, psychiatric, commercial, revolutionary, commercial origins, all these multiple origins. Lots of indirectness.
Yeah, I don't know, I guess trying to formulate my perspective a little bit, but it's like, what's exciting about the experience of something like ayahuasca or DMT is it's an unmediated experience. It, leads you to have a dissolution of the ego, direct phenomenological experience of what's happening. When we get into these, academic discourses, and whether it's art or philosophy or whatever, we get a little bit lost from that. When I look around my world, our world, I'm very concerned because of what's happening to the planet ecologically. We're actually on a course rapidly towards extinction. We're losing 150 to 200 species a day. Out of 8.2 estimated million species on the planet. So we're losing like 10% of the Earth's remaining biodiversity every 10 to 15 years. We're at 400 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which we know will lead to 4 degrees Celsius temperature warmer and 100-foot sea level higher. I'm talking to these young people in this audience who are going to be living in this deeply transformed world. And for me, the value of the psychedelic experience is that it's an opportunity for a phenomenological reset, because we're actually going to have to shift where we're going as a species in a relatively short period of time towards regenerative farming, renewable energy, and practices like that. And for me, the artists have a role that they can step into in this transformed world that we're entering, which is to recognize that we need new understanding, new mythologies, new imagery, and not to get so locked into maybe these discourses that to me sometimes sound a little bit like just like fulminating in a way, or how do we connect directly with our own nervous systems, with the reality that we're embedded in, and how do we somehow find a way to move past where we are now, because we've caught ourselves in a kind of series of like mental mediated prisons in a way.
Look, I think that's a very good point, and point taken. But I would say this. I would say, we had this discussion at lunch, and the point about this urgency is really essential and crucial, and it's overwhelming. But I guess I would say how I feel the art world is pretty useless. To a certain extent, to be able to really advance the urgent political agenda that needs to be activated. But my question would be, how does one go from, forget the art world for a second then, for a second let's put it aside, but how does one go, to the urgency of political action, collective political action at the state level that's needed to answer the emergency? How does one do that through the intensely personal experience of a trip? I see what you're pointing to, and I don't even disagree with that line of thinking or that genealogy of experience, for sure. But I'm just not, to me it would take, for that to be liberatory, for that to be political, for that to move into social action, it would seem to me to be a very long process, at the very least. It would seem to be multi-generational, I would argue, given the obscurity and the marginality of those practices, and given, as I was talking about at the beginning of my paper, the state's capacity to interdict all this, because I think more interdiction is coming. I think the minute that these kinds of things become truly, popular or whatever, they're going to be recriminalized. And so even just doing those kinds of drugs is going to be almost impossible, and maybe even doing it in Peru or in Ecuador or whatever. I don't know. I don't want to be pessimistic, but I'm just not sure how that model works.
Yeah, I totally disagree. I totally disagree with what you just said entirely.
Okay.
Let's take a question.
Well, no, but how you disagree might be quite important.
No, I could get into it, but maybe I'll open up to other voices.
It's just a follow-up. Actually, it's not a question, but in thinking about the terms, I believe also I heard Lars, but maybe it was a hallucination as well. You mentioned the expression narco-essentialism.
Yeah.
Okay, good. So I was thinking about, since the image of Eliot Isika appeared in the image, I was thinking about the correspondence between Eliot Isika and Leisha Clark. And it's a little bit disturbing, but I thought it was in my head, so that. And what's interesting in relationship to your question, John, how do you do that? How do you create something that is not an egoic trip? Leisha Clark is very clear when she writes to Eliot Isika, when she's starting to experiment in '74 with what she called structuring of the self, which were a series of propositions in which she was using precisely non-drugs, and Eli was doing cosmococa, so it's like cocaine as a way of getting into this kind of trip, let's say biopolitical trip, actually. And she was using objects on naked bodies, and through these objects that was always paradoxical, she would create a kind of what she called fragmentation of the self, morcellement. And then after that, the point was, as you were mentioning in terms of the ayahuasca trip, like you have a fragmentation, a vomiting, and then you restructure in the end. But in order for you to restructure, it's not the ego that restructures, or it's not you alone that restructure yourself, but actually the shaman or the collective or the trees or the environment that brings you back, right? And she says you only restructure the self in order to become a collective body. And in that sense, I feel it could be a very interesting way of thinking about these nervous systems, which is never belongs to a self, but is actually a collective nervous system, right? It's never my nervous system, it's our nervous system, right? And in that sense, like, how is it that then we could think about trips with glasses of water, as Deleuze and Guattari would say, and doses of prudence, right? You shoot up prudence, because it seems at a certain level, perhaps the trip, if it's an ego trip, I don't know if it will take us to a political condition. That is my question, actually.
Well, as I mentioned in my talk, I mean, I've seen viscerally people change their worldviews, and people with resources and capital suddenly shifting from, being part of banking structures or doing something exploitative to trying to figure out how to use their resources for more of a regenerative purposes. So that's like tangible, In terms of what John was saying, I mean, a number of things. First of all, I don't think the art is useless. Our world is useless. I think it's a repository of a kind of excess intellectual and financial capital. It's a ready-made social infrastructure that could be redirected towards how do we get ourselves out of this nightmare that we've created. And that's what I believe should happen in every field, whether it's the Catholic Church or social technologies, because we're really headed for a doom spiral right now. And we need to wake up in this machine that we've created and be like, we thought we were going to continue in these academic, specialized discourses and so on, but actually we can't do that anymore because we're running out of oxygen. Like, as we lose the tropical forests, we lose 20% of our oxygen. If the temperature goes up too high, the plankton start to expire, we lose 50% of our oxygen. So we've created this incredible machine. It looks amazing, except unfortunately it's asphyxiating us within it. I don't want to belabor it. I'm not trying to, it's just I'm putting it out there for you people, particularly you young people who are dealing with art and trying to figure out what your purpose is and function in the system. That this is like, we're really in a serious circumstance right now, and we don't have the leisure and the latitude that maybe we had a generation ago to keep kind of fulminating around certain types of critical discourses. Like, we need to figure out how we internalize the useful parts of them and then apply them to a circumstance that's just happens to be the one that we're in right now, And I think that the ayahuasca experience can be helpful to just make that apparent. Like for me, going down there to the Amazon, seeing also what passing through parts of the jungle that had been, decimated by the fossil fuel industry, made it something so visceral for me that I can't let go of it, and I don't mind being relentless and a bore about it because I don't really know what else to do at this point. I'd love to hear your thoughts on it, because I felt like, Florencia, that you had some similar ideas and reflections in a strange way. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I was thinking a lot about like this idea of the kind of hegemonic representation of like the psychedelic experience in art, and how, Lars, you're proposing another way. I missed this in your presentation. I don't know if you mentioned it, but does Pia Lindman mention that this artwork is part of a psychedelic experience, or no?
No, that's my postulate, that you can connect it to a thinking around the psychedelic experience.
Okay, so because I don't know if somebody had the chance to be in the last Sao Paulo Biennial, but I was there, and formally, it was very interesting to see how many artworks are now having this kind of eco-feminist sensibility, probably like the psychedelic experience, or it's like, it's not passing anymore by this kind of mass culture, visual impacting sensibility, but more related to earth, to shamanism. And it was like really present, even to a point of being a little bit redundant in the biennial. So I don't know if you were there, and I was curious about what you think about this kind of representations of what we could understand as psychedelic, or a reconnection with.
Yeah. Well, I was one of the curators of the biennial. So.
Sorry.
No, don't worry, it's fine. I'm very happy about your observation of that you think that there might be a connection between this type of artistic thinking around the psychedelic and sort of latter-day or contemporary eco-feminist sensibility. And you might also be right about the fact that it was a bit redundant, even. I think there was, I would like to emphasize that it's me who has, I'm the one who's talking about psychedelia here, and, you know, the history and the imaginary and all that thing. It was not really part of the sort of, you know, curatorial thematic of the biennial, directly at least. I mean, there was, I think it's important to say before we sort of dismiss the potential of what art can do, I think we should, I think it's important to emphasize that artists work with ecologies in a multiple sense, with natural ecologies, urban ecologies, ecologies of knowledge as well. And it's slow, it's symbolic, it's indirect, but it is there, definitely.
I'm very, very fascinated by the exchange with Daniel, and what I think we may be locked into a false polarity is how I'm thinking of it, because the pathway that you want to open up and have and spoken very eloquently to seems to me an entirely legitimate pathway. I have no problem at all with that. I think my problem, and this goes to what Lars has just said, as well as some comments that you make, I think my problem is that, to me, the art world, you know, and by the art world I mean, you know, artists who've made work, critics and art historians and all those folks who've been involved with it, students who are at schools, all that stuff. I think the art world was locked into an extraordinary and in some ways quite productive, but in other ways not productive, deconstructive moment that lasted roughly from, I don't know, the post-conceptual moment in the, well, precisely what I began my talk with Nixon's crusade against drugs, let's say 71, 72, this kind of time frame. You know, it lasted right up until, I guess, the overreach of institutional critique, which is still, I think, extraordinarily powerful as a force in art schools and communities and in the publishing industry, and so maybe up to the last 5 years or something. So that this deconstructive moment was rather, I think what the art world thought that it could do was mostly a sort of a tool of dismantling, unfolding, critiquing, the term critique itself so much associated with this world. And I feel the art world got stuck there more than, say, the philosophical world did. I mean, there's been a lot of talk today. We had Deleuze and Guattari cited many, many times by different people in different ways. It's not just Deleuze, but many other theorists and thinkers were cited. There was clearly more space, I think, for positive articulation and a good deal of that thinking than there was in some of the dominant, anyway, forms of art making, you know, in this arc from the early 70s until, I don't know, around 2005 or something. That's just my experience of living through, well, not the beginning of it, but living through the end game of that period. And while I think amazing things were done in the name of art, even under that regimen, why not? I mean, critique is extraordinarily important. I still think that it was this. I think art didn't do very well that almost instrumental, caregiving, positive, maybe utopian. It couldn't play that role especially well. And I do think that it's just beginning to learn how to do it now. And you do see movements perhaps to do with the collectivization of art rather than, you know, the hegemony of the individual. There are all sorts of things going on in the sort of global art world. And I say global art world because a lot of these things are not happening necessarily in London or New York. They're happening in Latin America, they're happening in Asia, they're happening in other locations. So I think that stuff is beginning, and I don't have no hope for art at all. In fact, I have rather more hope now than I did, you know, perhaps 10 years ago. Anyway, I just wanted to...
we need to wrap it up. So that's a great ending, I think. Beautiful ending. No, it's time to... we have to leave.
Yes, sorry. We have to wrap it up for today. And I really would like to thank Warren and his guests very much for their great contributions. And we can continue the conversation in the museum's cafe.